This is part 3 of the video series for the Expressive Symbolic Conceptual Portrait Assignment. And these are a few student examples, both from past years from other classes. Some of these first ones are mostly expressive, somewhat symbolic. There's a little bit of crossover there with conceptual. And then the last few are more strictly conceptual. You'll see when we get there. So I'll give you a little bit of a tour of these so you know what was going on. This was a very interesting expressive portrait and works in mixed media, which you're welcome to branch out and try for this kind of an assignment. You could work in collage or in some kind of an alternate media. In this case, this student took a vintage portrait of her mother and she reimagined it in matchsticks. There are about, I think she told us there were like 1,000 or 3,000 matches in here. And of course, burning them down to black for the darker areas and leaving them white with the white tips for the lighter areas. This was quite an intensive project. And there's a beautiful quality to this and some symbolism about the idea of matches and being potent and being burned out in all of those areas. So that's one example. This was a project from a few semesters ago, an expressive portrait of that a student did of a friend, really just using the same portrait, working in software, doing double exposures, laying it over, and using these really expressive colors to talk about sort of the internal psyche of his subject. Again, another student, I think, from that same class who did, of course, we'll all recognize our friend Toshiro, did similar to the Man Ray, did a multiple exposure of these different expressions of Toshiro. I believe this was done in camera with a flash, much as we've done in class playing with the mixed light. So that same student who used mirrors to make a series of expressive portraits. She first did the mirrors to emulate this, to talk about this kind of symbolism of looking in the mirror, looking at the self, and then she added just a hint of work in Photoshop. She came in and just manipulated and distorted that. Really, in talking about the distorted view that we have of ourselves. This student did a series of expressive portraits working. I'm not sure all the tools she employed, but she was playing with Photoshop during this semester. You could do this with any program you have access to or that you're familiar with. And she broke these down into a posterization. She actually had such a fun time doing these portraits and did them so successfully. There's our friend Toshiro again, that her office asked her to do a series of portraits of all of the people who worked in her office for them in this same style. This student, for her final project, actually, this was for the expressive project, but in another class she actually went further on these. She did a series of these portraits where she took the profile of the subject and then laid it over the full-on view and cropped it out so that we're seeing these at both at the same time. You may have seen a portrait of me on my door that's done the same way. So a really interesting multiple view, expressive, symbolic portrait style. This student did these 3 portraits of her friend April, and they all have a different kind of manipulation of the face, this idea of the part of the face that is not quite visible or is distorted or changed. I thought these were really interesting and expressive. And this is one of my favorite series. This was a student who actually did quite a lot of scanography. So she made a series of portraits of herself on her scanner. These are all self-portraits. If you have a scanner at home, I'll try to do, I may have to just do a written demonstration, but actually I think I can probably do a little video of how to do scanography. And she did this just by placing her face and hands onto the scanner. Later on, she did a series on food with the scanner, but this was her portrait series. This is a series by Nacho. You might recognize him. He was also working in Photoshop this semester and did a series about identity. In this one, where his body is actually starting to disintegrate and move away. And in this one, where he has another subject stand in, and it's talking about these layers of intimacy and identity, sexual identity. This student worked a lot with painting and drawing on his photos, so he printed them out. He added layers of paint, and then he rephotographed them afterwards, black and white paint. And he also did this really interesting process where he took a photograph and drew it and tore the drawing in half and laid it over the other one. So we see this relationship between the physically made and the photographic. I thought these were really quite interesting. This student did a series about women's relationship with the mirror. This reminds me a little bit of both Clementine Howardin and also in a slightly different way of Anne Brigman, but this sort of looking at oneself. Well, maybe even Claude Cahun. This artist, this is a conceptual piece, although it is visually very stunning. This artist, the student had been a survivor of domestic abuse, and she ended up doing a whole series of these. There's another one next to it, but the first one that she made was a self-portrait. So this is about being in a domestic abuse relationship, but also about surviving that. So you see the jacket. Inside of the jacket is the portrait of the survivor. And when you open the jacket, you see the portrait of the survivor with the marks on their body. The spikes are going in because that's what it likes. That's what she describes as the feeling of keeping that secret and of being abused. And then there is a quote at the bottom, which is a quote from her abuser. So it's a very powerful project and also conceptual portraiture. And on a lighter note, actually this student did a lot of really interesting self-portraits, but this was one of my favorite series. This is a student from a few years ago, and she really is interested in the gender fluidity as well as the changes of age. And so she did these two series, which she placed together, of herself as a male counterpart and a female counterpart, and then as those two gender sides aging. So really interesting stuff. Very heavily inspired by Cindy Sherman, but really doing her own original take on this. This student did a series of portraits, and these are not self-portraits, but they relate to something that she experienced. She did a series of portraits about the experience of being bullied, and these are conceptual portraits. So she actually had people who had been bullied who volunteered to come in and work with her. It was a very intense experience. And what happened during the session is that they were increasingly covered with dirt and mud, which is what they describe as the experience of being bullied, until they are really sort of holding in on themselves. And forgive me, this was a class where people did not give me digital images, so I'm showing you these sort of bad pictures of the pinned up photos. But this was really a very compelling series. And in the last frame, they're becoming smaller, disappearing, and becoming buried by the dirt that has been flung on them. This is also a conceptual portrait. This artist is African American. She made a set of 3 photos, one of these blonde Barbie dolls with a single dark-skinned Barbie doll in between, a portrait of herself as a negative and a positive, and a portrait of black Barbie dolls with the single blonde in the center. And these were laid out as a triptych. Really interesting, powerful work. And this is an artist from a photographer who recently graduated from Solano. He did a series of self-portraits with a mirror in the middle of the road, so you always see behind him. So these are conceptual portraits about what is in front of you, what is behind you, and self-observation. And I believe that's it. So hopefully this all together with the artist that I showed you will give you enough inspiration to get some ideas for your own project. We'll have a discussion where you can throw some ideas out, share some ideas with your classmates, and you'll have a little bit of time to work on this project. Okay, that's all.